stick and move.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and as always, you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball. We are back doing another of the season preview podcasts. Today we're going to be looking at a team in the Eastern Conference, a team with numerous questions and a significant amount of depth, which always confuses things and muddies the water for fantasy, and that is the Miami Heat. And to discuss everything that we need to know about the Miami Heat, I am joined by the co-hosts of the Locked On Heat podcast, Wes Goldberg and David Ramil. Wes, first of all, welcome back to you.
Thanks for having me back. Love being on here.
David, good to have you on as well.
Absolutely, Josh. Always a pleasure.
So we've got these two fantastic gentlemen who are going to be telling us everything that we need to know about the Miami Heat, because they were a really interesting team last year for fantasy. We all know about the 11-30 start and a 30-11 finish, but there were players who sort of came out of nowhere for this team to produce significant fantasy value, and we want to know if that's going to repeat, if there's going to be players who are going to be doing it in different ways, and how things are going to shake out for a team that you could almost make the argument has 12 players who probably should be every night rotation players in the NBA, and that's just not how the NBA works. So there's going to be some tough decisions for Spoelstra. There's going to be some issues with playing time for some teams. So we're going to try and get to the bottom of that. We'll start off by the way we always do on these shows, looking at the players that the team has acquired over the offseason and how they're going to fit in. The biggest name that joins this team this offseason is one of my boys, and that is Kelly Olynyk, who comes to the Miami Heat on a decent 4-year contract. Where's Kelly coming to this team? How do you think he fits in? I would say at this point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with this, that he pencils in at this point as the starting power forward and probably the backup center. Do you think that's a realistic expectation for Olynyk's role to start off?
It's possible. It's still up in the air about how this rotation is going to work. As you alluded to, there's just so many players. They re-signed James Johnson as well this summer, and I'm sure we're going to talk about James a little bit later, but you know, he started towards the end of last season at power forward, and he played really well, particularly against that Charlotte in the Charlotte Hornets game. He scored 26 points and had almost a triple-double in the game. And he could fill up the stat sheet, and you wonder if the Heat would value his versatility at that power forward position and kind of play a 4-out offense. Or you can have Olynyk there. Look, the Heat lost Willie Reed, so maybe they look at Olynyk as a backup center. I think Spoelstra is going to tinker with this throughout training camp in the preseason and kind of figure out what works the best. I think Olynyk starting at power forward is realistic, but I wouldn't expect it, just as James Johnson starting there is realistic, but I wouldn't expect that either. We just kind of have to wait and see.
David, if Olynyk does get the starting job, I still believe that Johnson is going to get the majority of those minutes at power forward. We saw how valuable he was, and they really valued that Johnson and Johnson bench combination last year, and keeping Tyler Johnson and James Johnson with the bench unit for the majority of the season. You're starting Luke Babbitt at power forward as pretty much a placeholder. Now, Olynyk is an upgrade over Babbitt, but do you see that if they do go that way with Olynyk there, that Johnson, no matter if he starts or what he does, that he's the guy that gets the bulk of the minutes at the power forward position?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the case last year when he was coming off the bench. So we'd assume that even if Olynyk was to start at power forward, you could naturally just slide him over to the 5 spot and then insert James Johnson in there, and that would work well. And like you alluded to, keeping that chemistry going along with Tyler Johnson, together, that was a really nice duo that came off the bench from Miami. So you'd probably like to see some kind of lineup that incorporates that as well.
Now, Johnson, over the last 3 months of last season, was playing 30-plus minutes a night, barely over 30 minutes, but it made him a significant fantasy contributor because, as you mentioned, Wes, he had that triple-double, or almost triple-double. He gets blocks, he gets steals. He's a triple-one threat, so he's a guy that can average a 3, a steal, and a block per game. He rebounds. He brought passing and playmaking and offense running to his game as well, and he took that step forward that we've been waiting for a while. For Johnson, I don't think it's realistic, Wes, that he plays those same amount of minutes as he did at the end of last season, just with the players returning. But I do think that over the course of the season, he played 27 minutes a game. I do think that he'll play a little bit more than that this year. Do you see that happening?
I think you're right on. Look, this is a team that brings in Kelly Olynyk. They drafted Bam Adebayo. They get Justice Winslow back, hopefully healthy. He could play some 4. as well. So yeah, James Johnson, he played 30 minutes a game because towards the end of the season because he had to, right? Number one, the Heat were making a playoff push, and number two, that they were so beaten up by injuries that he ended up starting towards the end of the year and having to break up that Johnson and Johnson second unit duo. If everybody is healthy, and hopefully they are, James Johnson wouldn't have to play 30 minutes a game, but 26, 27 minutes, that seems about right.
Back to Olynyk, who's how we started this conversation. He's a guy that if he was getting big minutes, say 30 minutes a night, I'd be really interested in him in fantasy. But we've seen that he's never been given that opportunity in Boston before, and I think it's going to be a similar situation here, that he will probably play minutes at the 4, minutes at the 5, but it's not going to be 29, 30 minutes, probably mid-20s in minutes. But his ability to stretch the floor as that stretch 4 and stretch 5 option, and he can rebound the ball, and he plays good defense, and he has pretty decent percentages as well. I think he's going to be a useful player, but he is getting drafted decently high, 110 on ESPN, which is too high for me for a guy I don't think is going to be getting the 30 minutes a night. But if something happens, Whiteside gets hurt, or Johnson gets hurt, or anything happens in that front court, and he pushes up to 28 to 29 minutes, then he is a must-grab player, in my opinion, because he does have significant fantasy abilities. The other guys, David, who were brought in, and Derek Walton on a 2-way contract, that's not going to have too much of an impact. AJ Hammonds came across in the Josh McRoberts salary dump trade. But the other player that I think has got a fairly significant upside, who, like Kelly Olynyk, came across from the Celtics, is Jordan Mickey, who they signed relatively late in the offseason process. He's unlikely to be a regular piece of the rotation, but I like what we've seen from Mickey as this shot-blocking, defensive power forward guy who's got some interesting skills, and I think it's a good move for Miami to bring him in.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and certainly adds a layer of versatility there that they might be lacking in a guy like Whiteside, and even a guy like Olynyk. I mean, Mickey's a guy who can stretch the floor, but he's also an adequate rim protector as well. He's got some athleticism. He's young. I think the reasoning behind it, Miami is a team that prides themselves on their ability to develop young players that may have been overlooked elsewhere. And I think they have a really good system in place with the Sioux Falls Skyforce in the G League. So I would assume that he'll probably play a significant amount of time there, get coached up, learn the game a little bit more effectively, and then be able to eventually make that transition. I can't see him making much of an impact just because, as you alluded to, there's so much depth in the front court, and I think there are other players that are much more capable of stepping in and making an immediate impact. He seems like more of a long-term project to look out for.
And that's how people in fantasy leagues should be approaching Mickey as well. For dynasty formats, when you're talking really deep stuff, you're going over 350 players deep, that sort of situation, Mickey's a guy that you can grab, wait on a couple of years, maybe Hassan Whiteside as he approaches the age of 30, some of his skills start to decline. James Johnson's already at that 30 years of age mark, and Mickey in 2 to 3 years' time could develop into a significant weapon defensively, shot blocking, really good rebounding as well. So he is a name to watch, but it is a long-term sort of thing, and we don't expect much, Wes, from AJ Hammonds, do we either?
No, AJ Hammonds might be he's, for all intents and purposes, probably the 15th man on the roster. If there is a situation where Pat Riley needs to use that $4.3 million cap exception, Hammonds might be the first guy out. The team they got him in that salary dump for McRoberts. It really was only to make the salaries work. I think they're just kind of keeping him around because he does have interesting abilities. He's a 7-footer who can shoot threes, but he wasn't all that impressive when they saw him in summer league. I think if something's to happen with this roster, if there's going to be a shakeup, if there's going to be a free agent acquisition, he might be the first guy out the door. And just to piggyback on Jordan Mickey, buy your stock now on Jordan Mickey because I'm a huge believer in him. And I think if you're in a dynasty league, go get him. Look what the Heat did with Tyler Johnson and Hassan Whiteside. I'm not saying Mickey's going to do that, but I think that's if you're going to pick one of these young front court guys that are kind of towards the end of the rotation, Mickey's the guy.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's got significant fantasy potential. His ability to block shots is tremendous, and he just never got that opportunity in Boston. So he's an interesting guy. The players that the Heat lost, Willie Reed went to the Clippers, Josh McRoberts went to the Mavs, and Luke Babbitt went to the Hawks. So we're not talking about a murderer's row of talent here that's really going to significantly deplete this team. Adding in Olynyk is an upgrade, plus they get all the guys back from injury as well. So it should be strengthening this team. In the draft, David, they had the 14th selection, selected Bam Adebayo out of Kentucky. He showed, I think, a little bit more than I expected in Summer League. Had some nice offensive moments. But with the acquisition of Olynyk, the presence of Hassan Whiteside, you would have to think that he is the third choice at centre. James Johnson even played some centre last season. So Adebayo, I don't think is going to see the court every night this season, and it's going to be a bit of a development curve for him. But how did you see what we saw from him in Summer League, and do you see that he could project to be the starting centre for this team in a couple of years?
Wow, starting center, that seems like a hopeful or optimistic case, best case scenario. I did like what I saw in Summer League. I got a chance to cover him in Orlando and saw him up close, and he certainly showed a lot more flexibility and versatility than I had anticipated. He's a guy who may have been pigeonholed a little bit in his role in Kentucky to play a certain way. We've seen that from other players in the past, Karl Anthony Towns, et cetera. But I think Adebayo has a lot more shooting range. And the thing is with Summer League, it's always worth taking with a grain of salt because these players are going to try things differently there. We saw guys like Okara White and Adebayo bringing the ball up. Chances are they won't be doing that in Miami if they were to get any kind of significant playing time whatsoever. So, it's nice to project him being at the starting center eventually, but I think his defense was a little shaky. And in Miami, that's obviously their bread and butter. He needs to play defense at a higher level. He certainly has the athleticism for it. He just needs to be a little bit more consistent with his footwork, stay grounded a little bit. We saw that from a young Whiteside, a guy who would chase a lot of blocks. When it comes to Adebayo, he doesn't have the same kind of length or height as Whiteside does. So it's going to be a little bit more about trying to control himself a little bit, rein in his emotions and continue to show off some of that shooting touch that we saw prior to the draft.
For some reason, Bam Adebayo is getting drafted to pick 147 in Yahoo leagues and 140 in ESPN, and there is absolutely no way that he is going to have any level of impact like that this season. I do not, unless people are predicting Hassan Whiteside and Kelly Olynyk both get injured. Adebayo is just not going to have that sort of an impact. But Wes, do you think that he can play alongside Whiteside at all?
That's not the best use of his talent. I mean, it would have to be in a case of injuries, but given Miami's options right now, I mean, they've got James Johnson, they've got Olynyk, they've got Justice Winslow, Okara White could play a little bit. I think Jordan Mickey is a better option at the 4 than Bam. Bam, you're exactly right. He's a very promising player. He's got a lot of great skill sets, but he projects as a versatile 5, but a 5 nonetheless, and someone who's going to make an impact down the road, but not quite this season.
I think he projects mainly as a high-ish quality backup center. That's what I think that for his career. Look, he might start at some point, but I don't even see him becoming an elite All-NBA level type center at any point. And I really don't love his fantasy projections at all. So he's a guy that he's picked 14 in the draft. He wouldn't be my 14th rookie that I would be selecting if I'm looking at dynasty values. There are guys that I'd want who are taken after him. John Collins is a great example as one of those guys who was taken after him, who I'd much prefer from a fantasy point of view than Bam Adebayo. Sure. He's the only draft pick they had this season. I want to talk about a couple of injuries with you, David. We'll start with Justice Winslow, who missed the majority of last season with a shoulder problem. Is he tracking okay for training camp? Is he going to be a full go? How do we prepare for Winslow this season? Is it just right, he's ready to go and let's start off where we were last season?
It's interesting that you bring it up. I was actually listening to our discussion last year about it, and there were such high hopes. And obviously those didn't really come to fruition because of the injuries. But even more so, I think with the absence of Dwayne Wade, the loss of Chris Bosh, et cetera, there was so much pressure, something that Wes and I have talked about before on Winslow to produce in his second year. There were such high expectations off his rookie season, and then he came in there. They put the ball in his hands so much, and quite honestly, he faltered in that role. He just wasn't capable of initiating offense as efficiently as we'd like. His shooting struggles are well documented. His defense, even, which was his best attribute, his rookie season, tended to struggle a little bit in his second year. Again, albeit in just 19 games, but it's something that you don't necessarily like to see out of a promising second-year player. So it's interesting to see whether or not he'll be able to make as much of an impact this year. I think expectations are obviously going to be somewhat lowered after last year's poor showing. What we've heard is that he's progressing as well as can be expected. He's healthy. He's got a lot to prove, and he's been, practicing with the team, et cetera. So I think he's going to be ready to start at the beginning of the year. But Wes and I have also talked on a number of occasions that we don't see him as the starter this year, despite the fact that he was the 10th pick overall a couple of seasons ago. He may be better or more effective at coming off the bench in the same role that James Johnson held last year. So that's something to look out for all of your fantasy users.
I hope that you are talking about my boyfriend Josh Richardson as becoming the starter ahead of him, because
Absolutely.
I'm massively. if there is a player that he's probably in my top 5 players in the entire NBA, Josh Richardson, and that might sound hyperbolic, but I am a huge Josh Richardson fan. I don't know, he's just something that's really fun about watching him. I don't think he's in the 5 best players clearly, but he's just fun. I just love watching him, and I want to see him succeed. He had all those injury problems last year, and I had this argument with people all the time, and you guys can maybe set me straight. And I'm talking about Richardson, and over the last month of the season, he averaged 1.5 steals, 1.5 blocks, and 1.5 threes per game, which is something that's pretty much never been done in NBA history over the course of the season. I'm not saying he can do it over a season, but this is his defensive ability. He got his feet and knee problems were sorted. He was hitting his shots again, and he looked fantastic. My argument that I've had people with Wes is I think that Richardson's a better player at this point than both Dion Waiters and Justice Winslow. And people call me crazy. How crazy am I for me to say that? Like, is it just me being an idiot?
You're being extremely crazy. I mean, first of all, nobody's better than Dion Waiters. We all know that.
I forgot about that.
But no, look, I mean, you're right. Richardson, when he's healthy, is among Miami's best players, and he has been. His rookie season, once he was healthy, he got into NBA shape in the second half of his rookie season and developed some skills. And in the second half was one of the best three-point shooters, not on the Heat, but in the league. I mean, he was shooting at Steph Curry level rates. And
he shot higher than Steph Curry. Didn't he shoot at 48%
yes,
or
he
something?
He did.
And then in the second season, obviously, he came into the year. He had some knee injuries that derailed the start of his season. He got healthy, and Dion Waiters got hurt. The great Dion Waiters got hurt, and Richardson stepped into that starting role that Waiters had played so well in. And Richardson came on really strong, like you're saying. I mean, he shows so much versatility. He's longer than Dion Waiters. I don't think he's as dynamic as a scorer.
No, that's fair.
And he doesn't have the irrational confidence that Waiters does. But he is a guy who thrives when he's starting, and that's why when David and I talk about the guy, somebody who could be a potential starter in the place of Justice Winslow, it's Josh Richardson. You look across the board at his stats; they are significantly better, and he is significantly more efficient when he's a starter versus when he's coming off the bench. When he comes off the bench, there's something about being a starter for him that allows him to play his game better and more efficiently. I love Richardson. He's a better player right now. If we're talking about young guys on this roster than Justice Winslow. Waiters, I'm not sure. I'm sure we're going to talk about him later. He's got more upside from just a points per game perspective. Yeah. And he can get you a steal and a block, but not at the same rate as Richardson. So I love Richardson's turnover ability. He's going to turn the ball over. He could steal the ball, take the ball, and bring it down the court and get you 2 points pretty quickly. And that's really valuable.
For Richardson, out of those 3 guys, if I'm taking a flyer on anyone late in a fantasy draft, it is him. I would take him over Waiters, who's going too high to me at pick 104 and 109, and Winslow's going at 123 on ESPN. Now, Winslow, we saw him have some decent games last year. He had a huge game against the Bulls. I think he had 15, 5, and 6 with multiple steals. He had a big 20 and 10 game against the Lakers. That's against some absolute trash heaps of teams, but he still had some decent games. And the big thing that we saw with Winslow is his ability to increase his assist rate and get the ball handling happening, and the steal numbers came up, but the shooting was disgusting. He had under 40% true shooting, and that needs to come up. And I do think that Richardson's a real chance to take that starting job off Winslow, and he's got a much higher fantasy upside. Now, as for Dion Waiters, David, he had a fantastic season last year. Everyone is aware of that, but it doesn't translate into an awesome fantasy year. He still was just inside the top 120. He was 119th, and he scored 16 points a game. But he didn't do enough in the other areas. His percentages were poor: 42 from the field, 64 from the free throw line. That they're negatives there. Yes, he did average 4 assists per game, but he's under a steal a game. And I just feel like some of what we saw from Dion Waiters last season might not be replicable this season. He just felt like he was hitting shots and taking shots at a rate that probably is not going to be able to continue forever for him. Do you think that there is a level of decline for Waiters coming this season, or are you just all aboard Dion?
it's hard not to be all aboard the Dion train, to be honest with you. But I see it as both. He could decline, but he could also get significantly better too. There's a possibility there that he'll take the next level. Wes and I already project him to be the team's leading scorer. And part of that is because he just fits so well in the system that worked so effectively last year. Miami's drive and kick game, particularly in that second half of the season when they went 30-11, was so effective, and Dion was such a big part of that. So, I think his struggles early in the season impacted his overall numbers. He certainly caught fire during that 13-game win streak, and they were just so much more effective when he was out there. And part of the reason why he was taking and making those big shots at the end of the game is because, quite frankly, without Dwayne Wade, without Chris Bosh there, he was the guy willing to step up in those situations. Goran Dragic is kind of easing into his leadership role in the third season with Miami. James Johnson wasn't necessarily that type of player to take those shots at the end of the game. Hassan Whiteside certainly isn't. It needed to be in somebody's hands, and Dion, as Wes pointed out, has never lacked confidence. So it was just such a perfect fit for him to take it. And, with each shot, it seemed like his confidence, in complete, stark contrast to Josh Richardson, Dion's confidence kept building. Richardson's confidence seemed to wane almost every time he would miss a shot. And so you just like seeing Waiters continue to go out there. Now, I think he's been challenged by Pat Riley already to play a larger number of games. He sat out a couple with injury, et cetera. He wasn't there for the last stretch of the season as they were fighting for a playoff spot. So I think he'll be healthier this year. I think he knows that there are higher expectations for him with a contract and everything else, but he's never shied away from that pressure or expectations. So I see him being a better player. And now the thing is, obviously, with him, if he can be more effective, being able to draw more free throws and be able to connect those at a higher rate, and to finish more effectively at the rim, which is an area where he struggled last year.
I feel like you just snuck a little bold statement in there that he's going to be the leading scorer on this team ahead of Goran Dragic.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
So last season he was third on the team in scoring, I believe, behind Whiteside and behind Dragic. So you think that he's going to leap up ahead? Like Dragic averaged 20 points a game, Whiteside averaged 17 points a game. So where do you see Waiters falling in that area?
Yeah, I think he's probably closer to 22 points per game or so. I think he's certainly capable of making that leap. If he's healthy in that first half of the season and towards that again, the 5 or 6 game stretch that he missed towards the end of it, I think he'd probably be a much better or higher scorer. So I think he's probably going to have the ball in his hands more than he did last year, where he was just trying to figure his role out. We saw Whiteside in particular was probably more effective as the third scoring option. Some of his numbers are inflated during the first half of the season when they struggled so much. And there were so many injuries. Somebody had to score, and it just fell on him to do so. But I think later on in the season, when Miami was so much more effective, the ball belongs in Dragic's hands and Waiters' hands, as guys willing and able to make much more difficult shots. Whiteside is so simplistic offensively, and I think he just struggles trying to score too much. He's much more effective, as we've noted in the past, as a guy who's just, can take a couple shots per game, not too many, just keep those numbers down and be much more efficient in the process.
Interesting. I did not expect to hear that you thought Waiters would be the high scorer in this team. If he averages 22 points a game, then people who are taking him at pick 100 on ESPN, that then becomes a value play because he's going to get those 4 assists and maybe he gets up to a steal a game as well. So that is quite interesting. Whereas Tyler Johnson had a significant role last season, I get the feeling with Waiters, with Richardson, with Winslow, or especially Waiters and Winslow being healthy, that it might be hard for Johnson to approach the same level of playing time that he saw last year. He was playing back up behind Goran Dragic as the primary backup. He was playing alongside Dragic as well. But with these extra guys into the mix now, and Waiters only played 40 games and Winslow played only 18 games, so that we're talking about a big chunk of minutes at that 1, 2, 3 position. Do you think that Johnson's role takes a step back this year, or some other way to get him at a similar level that he was last season?
Well, I don't think he's going to play quite 30 minutes a game like he did last year. For the exact reasons you're saying, is there's going to be a lot more guys, hopefully healthy and therefore in the mix. Miami has a pretty loaded backcourt. It's just as far as guys who need to play. You get Richardson back for a full season, hopefully. You get Waiters back for a full season, hopefully. And then there's also Wayne Ellington. Rodney McGruder, who spent most of last year at forward, is probably going to be mostly playing guard in a perfect world. So there's a lot of guys here that need some playing time. And you don't necessarily want Tyler Johnson playing 30 minutes a game. Look, he's effective in that 6-man role. He does a lot of really good things, especially as a guy who can come in as a combo guard. He could facilitate a little bit if the game needs it, or he could go ahead and score if the Heat need that. And that's valuable, and he'll continue to play that role. It just might not be at 30 minutes a game. That said, Tyler Johnson was one of Miami's most efficient players last year as far as assist to turnover ratio and his true shooting percentage, and just in the way that he was able to come into a game and kind of do whatever the Heat needed him to do. And oftentimes that was score off the bench. That second unit used to extend Miami's leads in the second half of the season. He was a big part of that. So 30 minutes a game, not quite, but he'll be efficient, and he's gonna get his points and he's gonna get his assists.
He was a guy that was a top 100 fantasy guy last year in those 30 minutes. He had 13.5 points, 4 boards, and 3.2 assists. He got 0.6 blocks, really good shot blocker as a point guard, 1.2 steals, decently efficient from the line, 77% and 43 from the field. But I just feel that, like we've just talked about, him getting back to that level is going to be tough just with all those other players. Now, of course, injuries can occur to anybody at any time, and that could push him up. But if we assume everyone's going to be decently healthy, I just don't see him being able to get back to that sort of a level. And he's getting drafted lower than where he was last year, 122 on ESPN, which I can sort of understand. But I just feel like his upside is capped by those other players around. For as good as he is, you'd feel that there is some level of step back coming with Tyler Johnson this season. David, Hassan Whiteside suffered, I don't know if suffered's the right word, but his block rate dropped significantly last season. And this happens often with players who put up huge block numbers as they become smarter, they become less aggressive. It also can tie in with maybe an athleticism decline, and I'm not saying that's what's happening in Whiteside's case. But what do you think was the big reason behind, he was blocking shots at a sensational rate the year before, and it dropped a huge percentage last year. Why was that? Was it him being smarter, saying, I've got to take on more of a leadership role, I've got to be able to stay on the court, avoid fouls, play better defense? Because as his block rate declined, his actual level of defense increased. So was it a conscious decision on him, and do you think we see that going further in that direction this season?
I think so. I think, the guy that was averaging the kind of blocks that he was a couple seasons ago, I'm not going to say he's not entirely there, because we still see glimpses of him every once in a while. But I think he's a smarter, better player now than he was a couple seasons ago. And that's just part of the maturation process from a guy who didn't necessarily play a whole heck of a lot of minutes. And I think, part of it was trying to make his name in a contract year, et cetera. So he had to put up those big numbers. He had to prove that he had been overlooked by 29 other teams, et cetera. That he deserved to be where he is. So much of trying to improve his 2K rating, et cetera. We look at those things as joke statements that he's made, but these are the kind of perceived slights that fuel the kind of guys that play in the NBA, and I think he was using those to motivate him. I think he's going to be much more effective, and I think he's going to be, again, the difference between him, like I said earlier, a guy like Whiteside and Bam Adebayo is the ability to control themselves now after a couple of years in the league and understanding how defense is played much more effectively. I think we're going to continue to see that upward trend in Whiteside's development. He was the league's leading rebounder last year, so even though he wasn't necessarily blocking as many shots, I think Miami's defense improved with Whiteside overall. They were just so much more effective utilizing him as the kind of fail-safe to block the shots at the rim, but they also defended so much more effectively at the three. I think they held teams to the least number of 3-point attempts in the league, if I'm not mistaken. They just would run guys off the perimeter, and it was just so much more effective. One guy after another would just rotate constantly, chasing guys off the perimeter, leading them towards Whiteside, who would always be there as a rather large obstacle on their way to the rim. So it just became a much more efficient, effective defense with him, and not not necessarily one that is so stat friendly, but maybe that's not what your listeners want to hear. But I think for Miami's purposes, it was certainly much more effective.
Yeah, look, he's not getting back to the 3+ blocks per game that he had in 2015-16. Like, he was at 2.1 last year. That's a realistic sort of expectation. Maybe he goes to 1.9 or 2 this season. The rebounds will be there. He'll score his field goal percentage efficiently. He's a solid second-round guy. But the one thing that does bother people about Hassan Whiteside and is an impact in fantasy is his free throw percentage. He's not quite as a punt free throw guy. But Wes, I'll ask you this question. At the end of 2015-16, Hassan Whiteside changed his free throw stroke. He started having that little jump, and he started hitting them at like 74, 75% for about the last 3 months of 2015-16. Last season, just changed it. Didn't do that at all. Changed his free throw style completely, and then started missing all his free throws again. Why did he do that? Like, why did he go away from something that was working and then went back to him being a terrible free throw shooter? And then again, he changed it halfway through the season and became better. Do you think that finally we go, okay, this is what works for him. Maybe you should just keep doing that for the entirety of a season?
So I don't know the answer for sure. I haven't spoken to Whiteside to figure this out, but this has bothered me, and I have a few theories. If you'll humor me on this,
I want to hear, because this bothered me immensely last year.
So you're at the end of the 15-16 season, he basically shoots free throws like jump shots. And his reasoning was, I'm way better at my jump shots than I am at my free throws, so I'll just do a jump shot at the free throw line. That made sense. But if you think about the kind of player, well, just his size. This is a true 7-footer who is 260, 270 pounds listed. If you're taking those extra jump shots that every time he goes to the free throw line, that can't be good on your knees. I have my theory. My theory is that somebody on the training staff of the Miami Heat said, "You can't do this. This is going to beat up your knees too much. It's not worth it for free throws. Learn to shoot free throws like a normal person." And so I think that's during the summer he worked on that a little bit. We know that he works on his shooting during the summer a lot, so I assume that he worked on his free throw shooting somewhat. And so he came into the season and he tried to shoot free throws traditionally, normally, and lessen the impact on his knees. And then towards the end of the year, Whiteside is a stubborn person. We could say that pretty safely.
Yep.
He probably was like, screw this. My free throw percentage is down. I don't want to be getting taken out at the end of games, because he was pretty often. He was getting taken out at the end of games for guys like Willie Reed, or they'd play James Johnson at center. He's like, I don't want to be taken out at the end of games. I want to play at the end of games. I'm shooting the free throws how I want, and you can't tell me otherwise. So he did. And that's what I think happened. So it wouldn't surprise me if that exact same thing happened again this next season. If you can, the Heat that say, dude, you gotta relax on your knees, you gotta lessen that impact, and he does it. But then once the Heat are in maybe the thick of a playoff push like last year, they say, you know what, the hell with it. Do whatever you gotta do for half a season. At least we saved your knees for the first half of the season. We gotta make the playoffs. That's my theory, but that's my best theory, I suppose.
The difference is stark. Like, he shot 62.8% from the line last season, but after the All-Star break, 74%. And it was pretty much exactly the same the year before. Like, barely above 60, and then shoot mid-70s. And it's a big difference. And it was just... And I understand that reasoning, again, leaves some... it makes some sense in terms of why he would do it, because there's literally no other reason. Like, there's no other reason to say, like, I was good at doing this, let's just go back to the way that I did it when I was terrible. Like, there was no common sense. And I would have thought that Spoelstra would have been saying to him, can you just shoot him like you were when it was actually working? But the knee theory does make a little bit of sense. But the difference is just, it's gigantic, and it does impact what they can do by not having him out on the court if he's not going to shoot. That way, maybe they could say to him, hey, just shoot jump shot free throws for the last quarter of a game. And maybe that keeps him on the court, and that can be
just do him underhanded.
He should. He's Chinana Onwaku style. Just need more than the one guy in the NBA that's shooting underhand free throws. But if they're going in, then it was frustrating. But look, hopefully we can see him at least bring it back up from 63% that it was last year, and maybe get to 70. Don't bank on it, but we've seen evidence to say that he can be a 70+ free throw percentage guy. So that is not going to make him an automatic punt guy for that category. So that is an important thing for us to pay attention to. Now, David, Goran Dragic has been the best player on this team, leading this team, but he's not exactly young. We're talking about a guy that's getting up there in age. He's playing currently in Eurobasket, so that's some extra miles, extra wear. That's the word I'm trying to find. Extra wear on the legs. He is 31 years of age. Are we looking at this is a dangerous time for players age of 31? Are we looking at a decline from Dragic this season, do you think?
I wouldn't expect one, to be honest with you. I think he's gotten much more efficient in the game that he's mastered here in Miami. I know there are concerns about his age, and those are realistic. Injuries are always going to be concerned regardless of your age, to be honest with you. So I can totally understand those. But, I mean, I look at the fact that he didn't average more than 20 minutes per game until his fourth NBA season. He was under that when he was with Houston and Phoenix. So I'm not all that concerned about it, to be honest with you. And I think most of it is because his game just isn't built on overpowering athleticism. He doesn't necessarily blow past a defender, and he doesn't. He constantly runs. That is one thing he loves to do. But it is not necessarily something that takes a huge toll on him. I think he just likes to keep that fast pace going. But when it comes to, one-on-one basketball, I don't think he's necessarily going to blow past somebody. So much of it is he's just going to be much more effective at creating space. And I was fortunate enough to be able to talk with him last year, and he told me about what he calls the iron shoulder, where he just lowers that into a defender and creates space around the rim. And you'll notice that if you watch him for any extended amount of time, it's so effective. I think he shot somewhere around 60, I want to say 60%, I can't know the exact number, around the rim. But most of that was just because he was trying to create space there. Because, again, he doesn't have overpowering height. He's not necessarily stronger than most guards. So, if in order for him to get off that shot effectively, he needs to do whatever he can to create a little space, and he uses that shoulder very effectively to do so. So it's not a game that's built on athleticism, and I don't see it necessarily declining. I think he's going to be at more or less the same numbers that he put last year. Again, I think having to incorporate as many players, again, assuming that everybody's healthy, I think, they might take a slight dip, if anything, but I think he'll be as efficient as he was last season, if not more so.
I want to get the Iron Shoulder going as a nickname for Goran Dragic now. That is brilliant, and that is going to be, if I can remember, I need to write this down. That is going to be my new nickname for Goran Dragic, the Iron Shoulder. I'm all in on that. That's going to make up some good Photoshop. So anyone who's listening to this who's good at Photoshop, send me your Goran Dragic Iron Shoulder Photoshops. We're good for that. I agree with you, David. I've got him pretty much the same, just a minor decline in his scoring maybe. But one thing he's always been is super efficient. He's 47% from the field last season, 48 the year before, 50 the 2 seasons before that. But Wes, what do we make of his three-point shooting? Because it is all over the place. The last 4 seasons for Goran Dragic three-point shooting, 41%, 35, 31, then just back to 41. So feels like there's no rhyme or reason to how his three-pointers go in. Do you think that we're going to see more above average three-point shooting, or are we going to have him back to below average three-point shooting this year?
Yeah, there was a point last year really throughout the whole second half. He was Miami's most reliable three-point shooter. It just seemed like every time he was shooting it was going in. And you're right. It just seems that one year over another, he's almost streaky for entire seasons. The good news for Dragic is that if Dion Waiters is back for the whole season, if he's healthy, and we assume he is, right, because he's gotten in the best shape of his career, everything we hear reaffirms that. The good news for him is that Waiters is really point guard B. Dragic is point guard A, Waiters is point guard B, and he's going to. They both were the only 2 teammates in the NBA that were within the top 6 of drives per game last season. That means that both of them have the ball equally in their hands. They're driving to the rim and they're kicking out to teammates. What that means for Dragic is that when Waiters is driving and kicking, Dragic is on the three-point line ready for a catch-and-shoot opportunity. And Dragic's catch-and-shoot numbers were really good last season. And I suspect that would be the case next season as well, because when you look at Dragic's other great three-point shooting year, that was the year in Phoenix where he basically did the same thing with Eric Bledsoe, right? It was point guard A and point guard B. So as long as that continues, right, the reason that didn't happen that next year for Phoenix is because they went out and got 30 new guards to add to that mix, and it just jumbled everything up, and Dragic forced a trade. So the Heat don't have that. I mean, they have plenty of guards, as we talked about, but none of them, the drive and kick type players, none of them are like vying for starters minutes. If anything, they'll just play the 3. So it's going to be Dragic, it's going to be Waiters running that offense. I think Dragic is going to have a lot of the same opportunities. I expect his three-point shooting to still be right around there. I don't think it'll be down to the 31%, the lower end of his career. I think it's going to be right at the higher end of his career.
I agree with you with that, actually. I've got him projected a little bit under the 40% from last year, but pretty similar. Yeah. And this team is just overflowing with guys who can handle the ball and guys who do run things. You talk about Dragic and Waiters, but Justice Winslow did it at times last year. Josh Richardson played point guard minutes last year. Tyler Johnson can do it. James Johnson did it. We're talking about 5 or 6 guys who are going to be significant parts of the rotation who average big chunks of assist numbers and handle the ball a lot. So there are going to be lots of guys who can take that primary initiation pressure off, even if it's just for 1 or 2 2 minutes. Give it to Winslow for a few plays. Let Richardson run it. Let Johnson run it. Let the other Johnson run it. Let Waiters run it. Let Dragic run it. There's 6 guys who can all do that and do it with a high level of proficiency, and it's going to make this team. You talk about positionless basketball. Like, I feel like that's what this team is. It's like everyone can pretty much do everything, with the exception of Whiteside, he's in the middle, he's anchoring things, but everyone else can just do everything, and they interchange, they can move around, and it does make things interesting. It gives value to these guys for fantasy. It takes away maybe the top end value of guys like Dragic, but he's still a player that's really solid at the end of the 3rd round, start of the 4th round, 40s sort of zone for fantasy, and he's going to continue to be that for this season. So I really like him as that solid. We just know what he's going to be. He's just solid. The floor is high, the ceiling is maybe muted, but it's just what he's going to be, and I don't see a huge amount changing with that. Now, David, Rodney McGruder played, I think, more than anyone would have anticipated last season. We've talked about the injuries to Richardson, Winslow, and Waiters, so that opened up that playing time. He did what he needed to do. Doesn't contribute on the stat sheet really at all, but it's going to be harder for him to find minutes this season, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't expect him playing a significant amount of time, to be honest with you. And considering the fact that he started 60-plus games last year and he was such an efficient part of what Miami was doing in the second half of the season, it's a huge drop-off, but it certainly seems like that's the most likely one. And I think it's just he was able to do the things that he does as well as could be expected. He wasn't going to, again, blow up the stat sheet. He wasn't going to dominate a game. He could play earnest defense. He could get the occasional three-pointer. He shot those at a pretty decent rate. He doesn't create a lot of offense. He's not much for putting the ball down and initiating any kind of playmaking or anything like that. But he was just mostly effective, and he tried very hard on defense. And that's worth a lot in Miami's system, and for a guy like Spoelstra, he really appreciated the bulldog and impact that McGruder would make on a daily basis. Just a guy who constantly tries in practice and would bring that same level of energy into a game type situation. But I just don't see him playing much. We saw him, he's generously listed at 6'4". He's very stocky, very built. But we saw him going up against taller players, especially at the 3, trying to guard guys like, Carmelo Anthony or Paul George or even a LeBron James, and just get roasted because he's so much shorter than they are. So they could just back him down or just pull up right over him, and he had no defense for that. He's just not that kind of a player who can get off the ground quickly and block shots or anything like that. So it's mostly about just trying to move his feet well, which he does, and stay in front of a player. But, when it comes to these taller, longer, more versatile shooters, they can just rise right over McGruder, and he has no chance of slowing them down. So I think you can expect a significant lack, or hit to his playing time next year.
He played 25 minutes a game last year, which is really unbelievable when you think about it, that he saw that much playing time. And I think there are going to be nights where he doesn't even see the court, given the depth of guys on the wing there. The other guy who's in that similar discussion is the Duke, Wayne Ellington, who hit a ton of threes last season, but he's going to be in that similar crunch for minutes. I would personally, Wes, put him above McGruder just for his ability to hit those threes. Do you think that he will be ahead of McGruder in that rotation, or is it going to be a horses for courses sort of situation? We need defense, let's put Rod in there, or we need threes, let's get Ellington in there.
Ellington is going to get more minutes than McGruder. He's basically going to be the backup 2 guard. I think we can suspect he just brings that dynamic type of 3-point shooting that otherwise doesn't exist on the Heat roster. This is a guy that can come off of screens in ways that other guys can't. A lot of the other guys on Miami's roster are catch and shoot guys that take advantage of Dragic and Waiters driving and kicking. Ellington can kind of create his own shot just by running around a defense a couple of times, coming off a screen, and all he needs is a split second to get a shot off. And for that reason, he's extremely valuable as a spacing element for Miami's offense, and therefore he's going to get a lot more playing time. I'll say this, though. When there is an injury, and there's going to be injuries, right, because this is the NBA season and it happens, I could see McGruder leaping ahead in that game above Ellington in playing time just because of the other holes he can fill. I mean, Ellington is going to get you 3-point shots. But that's basically it. He's not going to get you a whole lot of other things.
There's nothing else.
McGruder can come in. Let's say Josh Richardson is the starting 3, right? And he gets hurt for a couple games. I think McGruder steps in as a starter there, as opposed to maybe a Justice Winslow or somebody else. McGruder steps in, plays 25 minutes a game. Yeah. He'll get you a few points. He'll hit a couple threes for you maybe. He can get you steals. He's good on the boards. He likes to crash the boards. So he could fill in the stat sheet a little bit more than Ellington can.
With Allington, and this is a name that I bring up often. I talk about the 3-point category in fantasy basketball and how drafting for threes is not always the greatest strategy because you can find them anywhere. And Allington was a prime example of that. He was available on every single waiver wire, but he hit 2.5 threes per game last season, and you could just add him and get those. He does nothing else, but that's just an example of what these guys can do. He's going to take threes. He's going to hit threes. Even in limited minutes, he can be a useful streaming option on a weekend. The Heat might have a Saturday, Sunday back-to-back. And you can add Allington, and he can hit 5 or 6 threes across those 2 games, and that can be really useful. And he's a guy that you do always need to remember is going to be that, him and probably Nick Young are going to be the 2 guys in that role this year who are going to be able to hit 5 threes across 2 games and be really useful in a streaming situation. I don't think much changes there because he is an elite 3-point shooter, but he doesn't do a huge amount else. The last guy I think we really need to talk about here, David, is Okaro White, who I thought really handled himself well when he came up. Another guy from the G League that the Heat have developed and brought in to be a capable NBA player where you look at him and go, all right, who's this guy? But everything's making sense and he's fitting in well. But how does he get any sort of playing time this year? And is his future perhaps on a different team because he's just not going to see the minutes here as he's a restricted free agent this year?
Yeah, I think so. I also say that a lot of fans kind of tended to gravitate towards Okaro because he was picked up by the team right as they started that 13-game win streak. So he's kind of seen as the catalyst, although he wasn't really making much of an impact. But he just kind of coincided as they were having this unprecedented level of winning. So I think he's solid in what he does. He's a little turnover prone occasionally. He can do some things. Again, just like Adebayo was in Summer League, Okaro was asked to bring up the ball a bit, something that he's probably not going to be doing during the regular season if and when he gets any playing time. So your estimation about whether or not he's not going to get much playing time, I think, is spot on. Whether or not he's elsewhere, it's tough to say. I think they like his value. He's on a real cheap deal, obviously. That he's a guy that they've developed, so they already feel like they've invested some time there, and they really like his overall effort and his range of skills. He can shoot to 3, as we saw on a number of occasions last year. He can score. He's got length. He's not a bad defender, although he can get out of position at times. He's got some nice athleticism. He's got a range of skills there. Unfortunately, it's just hard to see them all put together at the same time effectively, and so that's why I could see his playing time taking a significant hit.
Whereas the last guy on this roster is living statue Udonis Haslem, who's coming back for his... I mean that in a tribute way. Like he's such a Heat legend. They're going to build a statue of him, but he's already sort of filling that role in that he's not going to be playing at all. Really, he's back for one last season. He's going to be mentoring people in the locker room, on the bench, but he is a legitimate break glass in case of multiple emergencies type of player for this team now, isn't he?
Well, first of all, is this statue going to be him throwing his mouth guard at who was the ref he did that to? I forget. Yeah, the statue should just be him throwing his mouth guard. But
the statue also has to be him without a shirt on, so you can see his back tattoo. I'm a huge fan of his back.
For sure.
Has to be. He can't be wearing a shirt. I need to see that tattoo.
There should be 2 separate statues, one of Haslem and one of his back tattoo.
Yep, that definitely needs to be done. But yeah, look, he's just going to be there for mentorship, isn't he?
Yeah, unless you get fantasy points for locker room leadership, then there's yeah, I mean, this is a guy that's going to play victory cigar minutes, maybe 30 seconds to a minute in blowouts on either end of great guy to have in real life basketball is all I could say.
He's projected for me as the 475th player this season, so that should tell you.
Is there anybody below him?
That's a good question. I might have a look. I reckon there might be. I'm going to have a quick look. It gets pretty murky down the bottom of this projection list. I'm just going to bring up my whole list because I was looking at as the Heat at a whole. Now I've got the wrong list up. David, you got some breaking news for us on the Miami Heat. Do you want to throw that out while I look up this?
I just got a notice from the Miami Heat media team there. They just signed Larry Drew II to a contract
again.
There. So, yes, again. So a guy who's been with the team before, obviously a guy who's probably best known for being dunked on by LeBron James a couple of years ago. I don't know how much playing time he'll get. I don't know. I don't know why the move.
Training camp body. Yeah, training camp body. Miami are now at 18 players. That's all it is.
Yeah, there are some players that are below Haslam. Let me read out the names who I've got below. Jamil Wilson for the Clippers, Kobe Simmons for the Grizzlies, Bronson Koenig for the Bucks, Bobby Brown from the Rockets, and James Michael McAdoo on a two-way with the Sixers. That's the list of guys.
Wow.
So yeah, we're down in the NBA luminaries down there, and only one of them's getting a statue, and it is
Seems company for Haslam.
It is Udonis Haslam. He is the best of that group. Let's go to each of you. We'll start with you, Wes. Who do you think is the breakout candidate on this team? You can frame breakout however you want. You can use whatever criteria you wanna use. Who is your guy, Wes?
So I have a really hard time narrowing it to one guy. So I'm going to give you a couple different options here. It's going to be, I like Josh Richardson just because of everything we talked about earlier, and he's going to actually play. So he has potential to get starters minutes where he wasn't doing that last year. He's going to play a lot more games than he did last year, and his skill set fits really nicely with this team in general. And I think he's got a real chance to be a breakout candidate. He's somebody that has ability to fill up the stat sheet. He's going to help you in steals, rebounds, possibly blocks. I love that. And then Justice Winslow. I know we kind of didn't talk so great about him earlier, but look, when he plays well, he fills it up, man. Like when he plays well, he gets close to triple doubles. I mean, he'll get you steals, rebounds, assists. If he could come in and play 20-something minutes a game in a backup role, like David and I both think he will and should, he could really start to fill him up. Everything that we saw from James Johnson last year, I think we could see Winslow maybe duplicate that this next year, and that would be valuable because he's going to hit a number of categories for you. So I would say Winslow and Richardson as real breakout candidates possibly.
Winslow's a guy that if he was able to improve his shooting level to Marcus Smart, and when you're talking about someone improving to Marcus Smart's level, you're in a real struggle. But if he
needs to get to like 32%,
he needs to get his true shooting above 40. Like he needs to be like he shot 18% from three. Like he needs to get that. Like even if it's to 28 or 29, then a lot changes for him. It opens up a lot more, and then I can see that. And the shooting could come.
It depends on what you think caused that shooting slump last year. I mean, this is a guy who shot pretty well in college at Duke, right?
Yep.
And
he also played the four,
in his first year, he didn't.
Duke, didn't he?
He did play the four, and there was a lot of room for him to take catch and shoot shots. Not so much. That hasn't been the case as much in the NBA, but he played 18 games last year and left with a shoulder injury. But before his shoulder was hurting, his wrist was bothering him. So maybe a lot of that could come into play. It depends on how injured you really believe he was. And he has said throughout this rehab process, he's really been able to just kind of get down to basics. And it's the same kind of stuff you always hear when guys rehab from long injuries and surgeries. But if you believe it, and if that's the one thing, right, is if he can get to an average rate at shooting, because he's way below average. He's one of the worst, if not the worst guy in the league. So if even average is a huge improvement for him. So if he can get to average, then all of a sudden you can live with that average shooting, and then you get to take advantage of all those other things that he brings to the table.
Like I'm pretty conservative with him in terms of projecting, but I've got him projected as true shooting at 45%, which is a huge jump, and that's still making him well below average. But he could take a jump of 10, 12, 13 points in that category, and that has a real impact on what he's able to do. It'll be interesting to see how he does that in his third year. Now, David, who have you got as a breakout candidate for this team?
Well, I think, Wes has some good options there, but clearly it's Larry Drew II. I agree that Josh Richardson is probably the player most likely to break out. I wrote about it recently. He seems like such an obvious fit at starting at the small forward position. He played 80% of his minutes there last year. Some of the most effective lineups he played in were with him playing along the same people who will be starting, or we project will be starting alongside him, including James Johnson, Whiteside, Dragic, and Waiters, or Tyler Johnson in that role last year. So either way, it's, he's a guy who can catch and shoot. He can play and defend at a high level. I think the starting boost will give him, or the starting position will give him a huge boost as far as his overall confidence, which is something we see him struggle with, quite honestly. Like there are moments there in the game where he'll put up a shot and he'll hang his head, which is weird body language for an NBA player, but he's still a guy who wants to prove himself. And I think getting that kind of confidence boost from Spoelstra and from the team will do wonders for him. So I think having guys like Dragic and Waiters playing alongside him in the same lineup where they can drive to the hoop and kick out to a wide open Josh Richardson from the corner or something like that will be a really big boost for him. So I think he's a guy that you could see putting up some nice numbers from 3-point range, playing some really solid defense, maybe having an assist or two per game. So he's a guy that you probably don't really look at too much. I mean, obviously you're a big fan of his, but I think considering he came at the same draft that Justice Winslow, that was the guy who all the hype was about, and understandably so, considering he was a top 10 pick. But for a guy like Richardson, who was a second-round steal, I think he's going to make a huge impact, and I think a lot of people will start to notice that he has a wide range of skills as well.
Yeah, all three of us are on the Richardson train for this year. I love him as a last pick in fantasy leagues. As I said, he's going to pick 141. I love that. He's clearly got the ability to go inside the top 100, and that's exactly what you want to look for in one of those last picks. He's also a restricted free agent, so he's looking for a significant chunk of money after this season, after being paid, very, very small amounts in comparison to other NBA players. So he's looking at a significant pay rise next season, which often happens for these young players. They do elevate their role as they go from that rookie scale contract or their first contract into a bigger one. Guys who I think are a little bit overvoted, who talked about Olynyk at 111, I just don't really like that. And Bam Adebayo, I don't see there's any reason to be picking him in any sort of fantasy league. Dion Waiters, I thought, was a little bit high at 106, but if you believe what David and Wes think, and he's going to be a 20-point per game scorer, then that's totally a fine pick there. The last thing, guys, I want to get you to have your opinions on is the the Vegas over-unders. So Vegas has got the Heat at 43.5. ESPN's Kevin Pelton has them projected at 42.3 wins. Wes, are you going over or under 43.5?
I've already bet $300 on the over, so they better hit the over.
David,
I haven't bet any money on them, but I think they'll go over.
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll go over. Obviously the Eastern Conference is in flux, between Boston and Cleveland and everything else. I think there's room for them to notch a couple of wins there. And I think, one of the things that we've talked about before in our podcast is the fact that there's going to be an increased level of continuity there from how they played in the second half of last season. I think that'll carry over. There seems to be a real high level of chemistry there. Guys, bonding together in the offseason. Everybody's been practicing regularly. I think they'll come into the season in great shape because that's just what Miami does and emphasizes at a high level. And I think they'll pile up a significant number of wins. Certainly an improvement over how they started last year, but I think they'll probably finish at around 45, 46 wins.
I think there's a couple of things to take into. I do think that they'll go over, but people are looking at them and saying, they finished 30-11 last season, so they're going to be pushing up to high 40s. But they also started 11-30. We're talking about exactly the same sample size and completely reverse record. So you could say, but they started 11-30, so maybe they only win 20 games for the season, and that's clearly not realistic. But a lot of people are thinking, 30-11, best team or second best team over that stretch. Maybe they push it forward to a top 3 seed and 50 wins. I think that's unrealistic, but I also do think that they'll beat the 43.5 that Vegas has them set, or that has the over-under set at this year. So I'm with you guys in going the over on that one there. So I think that covers everything for the Miami Heat. Wes, thank you for coming on. You too, David. I'll get to you in a sec. But Wes, what have you got that you want to plug? Locked On Heat-wise, writing-wise, Twitter-wise? Give us your info.
Just go listen to the show Locked On Heat if you're a Heat fan, or if you just want to know what's going on with the Miami Heat, because I think they're one of the most interesting teams in the league this season. They can go in so many ways, just as you said, that their over-under is kind of right in the middle, and they can kind of go on either end of it. So listen to us over at Locked On Heat. We'd really appreciate it. You could follow me on Twitter at WC Goldberg. That's it.
David, what have you got to plug out there?
Yeah, well, you can find my writing at The Step Back or also on FanRag NBA. That's where you'll find most of my writing nowadays. Or if I'm not there, I'll probably be talking about the Heat at Locked On Heat. So follow us also at Allo Heat, or you can follow me at Twitter at DRamil13.
All right, so go and follow those guys. Check out Locked On Heat, and I agree. The Heat are one of the more interesting teams this season. They're also a pretty fun team with lots of fun players. So make sure you're watching Miami Heat games. There will be lots to take out of it for fantasy and just also pure basketball enjoyment. Thanks, guys, once again for coming on.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
We are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Kelly Olynyk.